Hello, and welcome back to the event for week 4 for Oxford University Linguistics Society. We are here with Professor David Poeppel, who is Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at New York University and has been Director of the Department of Neuroscience at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt am Main for about 6 years. He's done a huge amount of research in the neurobiology of language, and we're going to be speaking to him about that. We're honored to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's fun to talk to you.
All right, so we'll start with the first question. You've written a lot about what neuroscience and linguistic theory can say to one another, but also quite importantly about what they can't say to one another. Could you tell us a little more about how you see them sort of fitting together and where they come apart?
So I would very much like to think that in the long game, they will increasingly fit together. But for now, the neurobiology and linguistics are still a bit far apart. And so in part, that's an issue of just for practical reasons, and then there are sort of principled reasons. So, just very briefly share with you what I have in mind here. So I'm very impressed with what linguistics has achieved over, let's say, 2,000 years or more. It's not new, and we have really, it's accelerated significantly in the last, let's say, 60 or 70 years since it's become more closely aligned with, let's say, the cognitive sciences or computational methodology. But in general, linguistics, or the study of language, is absolutely fascinating, fun, and deep, and it's something about who we are and how we are organized. And so in the context of doing that research, linguistics has come up with just an enormous amount of insight at a very fine grain about many different phenomena across languages. And so it's about what it is that you know as a speaker of a different language. So how are different languages organized? How are they acquired? How are they processed? What is the inventory of? And so regardless of what aspect of language you're studying, from acoustic phonetics to compositional semantics, there's been really a wonderful amount of data and insight cross-linguistically. So what that has resulted in is a kind of, what I informally often call just a parts list. Right? So the parts list of the primitives, or the ontology, if you want to be more fancy, of the field for which there's really quite considerable evidence. That doesn't mean it's the final word, but it means that there are extremely well-motivated, empirically well-motivated hypotheses about the infrastructure of linguistics. Likewise, neuroscience, which is a little bit newer as a field, has made unbelievable progress, right? So we have a pretty good idea about, we don't know how the brain works, far from it, but we have a pretty good idea of what sort of, again, the parts list is. We're getting better and better at the different cell types and the different types of physiological activities. Now, if we believe both areas of investigation, and we have no reason to doubt them, serious scholars doing serious work, then you would assume that there should be, assuming that language is something that's a property of brains, then you assume that there's some kind of very clear link between these domains, right? So that there's something that is a kind of principled relation between the stuff of language and the stuff of brains. And that's where things are not so good, or let's say in the best case, correlational. So my colleague from the University of Pennsylvania, Dave Embick, and I have worried about this problem for many years and written some papers about it, and we discuss it often, which is how can we have a kind of better alignment across the disciplines? And one thing we've argued over the years is we can do better simply by attending to each other's fields more, right? So this is what we call the granularity mismatch problem, which is simply, linguistics knows a lot, or the language sciences have very nuanced, detail-oriented insights when it addresses language. And when neurobiologists deal with language, including me, the questions are pretty coarse. And so that mismatch in the grain size of the question can lead to all kinds of unsatisfactory stuff, or maybe it just remains superficially correlational, and that can't be what we want. We want to do better than that. And so that's a problem, right? So from both directions. So we have to have a kind of shared vocabulary and shared conceptual understanding, but it has to be at the right level of analysis, and that's actually tricky. But that's more of a practical problem. Like, how can linguists with a kind of taste for experimentation and a taste for implementation talk to neurobiologists, and vice versa? How can a neurobiologist say, man, this insight from linguistics is so cool and so deeply motivated, I got to figure out how that works. So, but that's a practical problem that can be solved, and I think sort of step by step it's getting solved more and more by researchers. But then there's a more difficult problem, which is the kind of, how is the stuff of mind, in this case linguistics, related to the stuff of meat of the brain? And that's kind of just in our case an instance of the mind-body problem, and we don't have a particularly good solution. We assume that language is a property of brains, and otherwise we should probably stop, or I should stop. I should get a different job. But assuming that that's not a crazy question, then it would be good to reflect very deeply on what such linking hypotheses need to look like. So if you're committed to, say, I don't know, the notion of, let's say, morphine, which you have good reason to be committed to, can you even point in a coarse sense to the brain structure and function that would underwrite this kind of concept or be related to it? And we simply have no idea. So we have some correlational notions about this, but in a deep explanatory sense, we don't know. So what does that mean? It means that when you study brain and language, like people, I often do, or I do, then your assumption is either you're going to learn something about the brain, or you're going to learn something about language, or ideally both. But what happens often is you learn about nothing, right? So this is what I have often called interdisciplinary cross-sterilization. Right? So instead of sort of animating each other's insights, it's sort of a little bit of mediocre biology and a little bit of mediocre linguistics. They're not particularly well connected, and there's some loose correlations, and that's fine. It's maybe an intermediate step, but our yearning is probably higher, should be more ambitious. And so the question is, how can we take deep next steps in understanding this part of how human minds and brains are organized, how they work, and so on. So it's a very long-winded answer to the question. It's complicated.
Yeah. So one way of cutting up the disciplines, at least of sort of psycholinguistics and theoretical linguistics, has been kind of to say, well, one's dealing with our application of our knowledge, performance systems, and the other's dealing with competence, our knowledge. Do you think this way of dividing the fields is accurate or even helpful?
Well, it's definitely helpful to think about many cuts and splits to kind of illuminate the problem, right? So I think it's an extremely useful way to think, to sort of parse the problem into subparts. And that particular distinction, which is really, a result of thinking of the 1950s and 1960s in the generative context, is very interesting, actually. And it makes, very bold assumptions about idealization and things like that, right? So it's rooted in thinking about how other disciplines are done, and people feel very, some people endorse that way of thinking about stuff. Some people find it just appalling. But in principle, it strikes me as pretty vanilla and uncontroversial in the sense that you're just making some idealizations, right? So the notion of a competence system that's sort of isolated in an ideal speaker hearer community, it's trivially true that that's an idealization, just like the notion of an inclined plane with no friction is an idealization. You're just trying to find some kind of generalizations and principles that underlie certain things. And so I think it's actually been a pretty interesting notion, this distinction. Now, here's a kind of important twist. When Jerry Fodor, Tom Bever, and Merrill Garrett wrote this extremely influential book, Psychology of Language, they, people who are deeply influenced by linguistic theory, they really kind of celebrated that split. And partly that had to do with rejections of what was then called the derivational theory of complexity. right? So the more complicated something is in the context of a derivation that is a representational thing, the more processing costs. Seems like a pretty reasonable theory, but that was sort of, it didn't work out that way. And so there was a really deep split between linguistics and psycholinguistics at that point. And I think that in the long game has been actually a negative effect. That is because it then sort of allowed both domains of research to sort of go, unconstrained, unshackled from each other, which has led, of course, to important methodological advances and no doubt a lot of insights. But one wishes for a tighter alignment over the last, 30, 40 years of the study of competent systems, of linguistic knowledge in the technical sense, and the sort of interface to the sensory motor systems, as it's now called, right? So the uncoupling of that has been, I think, so has been sort of locally helpful. So, or parochially, a lot of insights have been made in psycholinguistics and in linguistics proper. But a big price is paid by thinking of these as independent. And it means that theory construction has proceeded very independently of processing research. And processing research has proceeded, to my view, too independently from theoretical constraints. So I think the price was paid with Fodor, Bever, Garrett, who are giants of the field and so on. But that was probably historically a kind of inflection point, which is now a little bit regrettable. So let's say local battles were won, but the war may have been lost with that important publication of the psychology of language. So that's not to say that you should not pursue both things, but I think it requires a fair amount of capacity of abstraction to figure out, what should stick together and what not.
Yeah. So following on from that, you've expressed concern that a lot of the work in generative grammar has not really been concerned with real-time computation in mind. Could you elaborate on that a little more? And do you think sort of experimental work could help us choose between competing theories of syntax or something like that?
I mean, one would hope so, right? I mean, so you would like your fields to be integrated to the extent that, like, suppose you have two really good alternative theories of, I don't know, raising, right, or something like that, or control, something, something you learn about in syntax, and and you have a very difficult time disentangling them with, let's say, cross-linguistic considerations or something like that. In the best of all possible worlds, you'd be able to kind of work those out, those alternative hypotheses, as predictions that that have clear processing consequences. I mean, you'd like to be able to say, look, this kind of empty category, if I endorse it, has certain kind of consequences. This other kind of empty category, if I should have these other consequences, and I should be able to be sufficiently specific in my processing predictions that I could then do that. So that would be a case where then empirical research of a certain form could adjudicate between alternative hypotheses about, let's say, the status of certain kinds of empty categories or something like that, right? So that's possible. Doesn't mean it's easy. I mean, research is hard. It sucks. But one could imagine that one takes the notion of theories seriously in that they are always also a statement about processing, right? So there's no notion of, let's say, let's say a popular notion now, like merge. Is there a notion like that independent of the operation that makes it happen and that has particular consequences at the interfaces, as we call it, right? So you can build structural representation all day long, but at the end of the day, we're having this conversation because something about the input-output interfaces takes that, builds the right kind of representation to allow you to then either make sense of what I'm saying, or maybe I'm not making sense. But you can say, this guy doesn't make any sense, right? So it means you at least got the information the right way. So that should be a kind of, I mean, it doesn't mean, right? So it's a kind of slippery slope. It sounds a little bit like, oh, every syntactician or every phonologist or every semanticist should also be, de facto a psycholinguist or something like that. I mean, I think that's too strong, and it's not, people are specialized to learn about certain generalizations to, do scholarly work on it. But a mindfulness that one is part of the cognitive sciences and even, the biological sciences would be good, in the sense that our goal for all of us is presumably to figure out how the damn thing works. I don't really care where my information comes from. If my, this stuff is really hard. And so if, my insight comes from your new work on, French verb, I don't know, inflection or something like that, and mine happens to come from some other imaging study, who cares? It's evidence in light of some theory or hypothesis that we're testing. And so there's no hierarchy of evidence, right? Evidence is just evidence.
Yeah.
So the question is, can linguists and experimentalist biologists formulate their theoretical stance in a way that it permits experimental consequences? And that's not so easy, right?
Yeah. So do you worry that something like a minimalist program, which operates at a sort of enormous level of abstraction, is quite far away from the brain sciences?
No, I mean, it depends on the researcher, right? I mean,
Okay.
So that's a theoretical, or it's not even, so if you ask, as Chomsky says about this, it's not a theory, it's an approach.
Yeah.
Right? So there are people, there are people who work on this approach who feel very near and dear to experimental research, and others who are less interested in it. So I think that's a little bit independent of the particular theoretical commitments there, right? So you can say, well, I endorse these, fundamental assumptions or something like that. But so it's a little bit more about the researcher's stance. It's not intrinsically tied to the theoretical commitments you make, right? It's tied to, well, like, assuming this is sort of stuff I think is a plausible hypothesis, then you can then either just proceed, or you can say, well, let me think about this. How would this actually work if I talk to someone who works on, let's say, memory structures? How would you pull something like this out of a bag of, we say, oh, there's a bag of words. Well, okay, how is that supposed to work? Like, you're stipulating that.
Yeah.
Like, we haven't the vaguest idea how that works. So I think it's important. So it's not framework dependent. It's more sort of research interest dependent, and partly an acknowledgement that linguistics is not different from any other disciplines, and it's part of the cognitive sciences, and therefore should draw on the advantages that carries along with it.
Yeah. So I suppose carrying on from that, you've mentioned computation and representation. Of course, linguists like to talk about, psycholinguists especially, about representations. And this has been pretty much the fundamental notion in cognitive science, I suppose, of mental processing as computation. How could you spell out a little more how you see the brain carrying out these computations? That can be quite difficult to picture for someone new to the field.
Well, it's even more difficult for someone who's in the field, because the more I know, the less I know. So, I mean, it's better if I could just make a guess. And so, look, certainly a large fraction of those of us who work in this kind of stuff adopt what has been called the computational theory of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And in the different fields, doesn't matter whether you're working on linguistics or memory or attention, So that means that thought, is a species of computation, and that in turn means that it's computation over representations. Right? Yeah. So it forces you to assume that there are such things as representations somewhere in our minds and brains, and we haven't the vaguest idea what those are. We have hypotheses, and that there are computations of certain forms, and we likewise don't know what they are. So, but the underlying assumption is simply that, right? So that there's a kind of representational inventory. Mm-hmm. Let's take again language, right? So in language, I happen to think that, for instance, the notion of distinctive feature in phonology is like a primitive.
Yeah.
It's an irreducible primitive in neural and computational terms. And some linguists would endorse that, others not. And similarly, I think that actually for other reasons, that's much more controversial in linguistics, I happen to think and argue that the notion, sticking with phonology, of a syllable is actually fundamental. because it's the fundamental unit for input process. That's how you actually segregate information during the process. And it's also one of the fundamental building blocks for the production system. So it's how perception and production systems are actually coupled. So based on experimental research, both from psycholinguistics, but in this case, mostly neurolinguistics, I would suggest that actually the notion of syllable has to be fundamental. It has to be one of the primitives. And that doesn't mean it replaces anything else, but it means I would advocate that that's something of the, of the basic inventory representation. Now, but so you're going to make a whole bunch of these, right? That's your parts list. And now you have to have a parts list of computation. So let's take the simplest one, right? You want to make a sequence of things. You have an X and a Y, and you have to chain them together, right? So that would be like for instance, that would be a prerequisite for something like merge. Mm-hmm. You have to first, you have an unordered list of things, just to make it you have to stick them together at some point because they have to be, spit out or read into your tape. So how do you do that? How do you even take two items, an X and a Y, and put them in a chain? And even more tricky, how do you make them be, a common representation that then has some kind of index? So I took, an adjective and a noun, and they fit together, and then the whole thing becomes a species of noun. Right? So I'm sitting at a black table. That black table is a species of table, not a species of black. Yeah. Because of whatever headedness constraints in the language we're speaking and so on. So that's the kind of computation you have to figure out. So something even as simple as making a chain or multiplication. So in other areas of neurobiology, there has been more progress on that, right? So for instance, there's been interesting work on cells that do, where we can characterize what they do as multiplication. That's very interesting, right? So you get some input here, you get some input here, and then you get some output from a group of cells. And it looks like what the output is a kind of multiplication of the, that's cool. There's very recent evidence that dendrites on neurons, so little pieces on the input side of neurons, can do something like an XOR computation, like an exclusive OR. So you have to, the way you want to think about it is you want to break it down into like the simplest, most boring little things, right? So literally, and it's sort of helpful to think about it like an engineer. Suppose you had to build it, right? So you have a bunch of chips and you just have some resistors and capacitors, and your job is just to, what's the most elementary circuit that would give me what I need? Mm-hmm. And then your job is to go to your friendly neighborhood neurobiologist and say, okay, well, I am pretty convinced that I have to be able to do this. Can you show me what kind of circuit in the brain would do it, right? So you have to be, as I've argued a lot, cognitive scientists and linguists should take a more muscular stance. It shouldn't be that, linguistics reduces to neurobiology. On the contrary, linguists should confront computationalists and other scientists with particular well-motivated and empirically solid insights and say, hey, we're pretty confident that this has to work. Go figure out how it works. That's your job. And so the kind of computations you might think of are simple things like that: addition, subtraction, multiplication. Yeah. And then the question is, well, how would you implement that kind of stuff in neural tissue? And that's what people do in systems level neurobiology. They try to work on circuits, and there are people who then literally try to figure out, well, how would you actually have an equation in neural tissue? Because we know that you have to actually. The most elegant work in this context is in insect navigation. And so insect navigation, people have a pretty clear idea of what kind of equation has to be carried around in the 50,000 cells that a desert ant, for instance, has. It has to take a value, a variable that gets plugged in. That equation actually changes as a function of its diurnal rhythm, and then an output comes out. It tells you where to go. And so it's pretty fancy stuff, but it's that level of math or computation. And then the trick is to find, well, does it match the kind of circuitry that brains would have and do kind of naturally? And is it a good, so that's the sort of link from linguistics to spell it out into computational primitives, which in turn are kind of possibly linked to neurobiological implementation.
That was leads perfectly onto my next question. Actually, it was so people like Fodor and Pilshin suggested that one way of looking at neural architecture was, if connectionism or something like that is true, it would be true at the sort of implementational level, but Turing-style computation would be the correct level of abstraction for cognitive science. But more recently, people like Randy Gallistel have taken that further and said, well, it could be exactly the kind of thing you mentioned, Turing-style computation all the way down. And I was just going to ask if you had a sort of a stance on that, and whether you see one tack as more productive for neurolinguists. So if
I mean, well, I have a personal taste and I have a recommendation. So, I mean, let me make the recommendation first. If you are starting out and you still need a job, learn Python, get into your deep neural nets, and work with the connectionist framework. Because it's sort of practical and it works. Whether it has any relationship to what human minds and brains do, I think it's remote. My own interest is actually very much in the stuff that Randy is doing, and so which is, and it's less about, I think the most interesting problem, and I'm trying to figure out how to even approach it at all. It's not clear how to do it. Is less about the computation part, which I think we have a grip on, in fact, and I suspect in 20 years we have a really good grip on. It's about storage, and basically where do you store where and how do you store the inventory? I mean, if you have a bag of morphemes, how is that written down? And there you might need Turing-style computation, and how to do that and where in a body to do that is completely unclear. I mean, Randy Gallistel has a very bold suggestion about intracellular storage and computation. That's just, I mean, that's a cool idea. How to actually investigate that and whether it works, we don't know. I mean, we're going to talk about that soon, actually, Randy and I, to see if we can even figure out how to ask the question the right way, right? It's another one of those examples where the theory makes some interesting, it's an interesting story. How do you actualize? How do you then test? If it were so, what kind of experiment would lead you to that conclusion plausibly? And that's extremely difficult in this context. Mm-hmm. But I think that if you're, generationally speaking, like you guys are young and should be aggressive Python users and get your head around what everybody's doing, because it's gonna, look, you might need that job, and you might no matter what you believe, you might want to teach that or have to teach that, and so on. So just take your medicine, learn every recent LSTM and RNN, and everybody in my lab is wanting to do that and gets good at stuff because it's cool and it's fun, and like you get sort of elegant that it works from an engineering point of view. It's impressive. It's a different question, as we all acknowledge, whether that's actually something that is an approach to studying the human mind and brain. Mm-hmm. Slightly different question, right? So just because, for instance, the machine learning based, deeply trained things do a really pretty impressive job at recognition right now, speech recognition. Yeah. That's super cool. I'm totally into it. But that's not what that's different than studying how people do it. Yeah. Right. I mean, I have to account for like, what's a cochlea? What's the auditory pathway? What do cortical neurons care about? I mean, that's stuff I have to worry about. Mm. What representations does such an architecture license? Yeah. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my gut level recommendation is learn the modern stuff, and my intellectual passion is go for the really weird stuff, except you're not going to get tenure that way. So you have to, I think it's cool to be bold, and I want to pursue that kind of thing, but it's extremely risky and likely to fail. Mm. So I suppose in terms of taking risks and the progress of neuroscience as it's going, you've mentioned that the classical model has been incorrect along too many lines for recent developments to merely count as revision. Could you briefly spell out what the classical model of language in the brain is and what's wrong with it? Yeah, I mean, so the thing that, in every linguistics book or psychology book or neurology book, there's a kind of chapter on language. Usually there's one, language in the brain. And there is what we have called from it, or what is more or less formally called the classical model, is the picture of a left hemisphere, which you sort of, imagine in front of you, a left hemisphere, and the swish, like two Nike things in each other. And there's a region in the front of the brain, which is typically called Broca's area, and a region in the back of the brain, which is typically called Wernicke's area. And then there's a string of cables between the two. And so this is a model that goes back to 1861 with the discovery that a particular brain injury led to performance deficits in a patient of Broca's, Mr. Le Borgne. So this guy could only say one thing, ton, 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 ton. He was subsequently called ton in the literature. And when he died and Broca performed an autopsy, he noticed that there was a particular chunk of brain compromised, and he made the kind of totally reasonable inference. There is a relationship between the deficit, the behavioral deficit, and the brain structure. This, by the way, in its own historical context is very important because people were really arguing about the notion of functional localization a lot. So this was a very important insight by Broca. Then he wrote a second paper a few years later, 1865, where he basically kind of enriched the notion of lateralization. So that really stuck because it was an interesting prediction. So in fact, if you have a lesion and you don't speak fluently, you have telegraphic speech, as it's sometimes called, or phasic output, it is often correlated with that kind of lesion. Some years later, 1874, Wernicke, a German neurologist, found the one in the back, right? So if you have a lesion in the back of the temporal lobe, and then you can still speak, it's not disfluent in the sense of telegraphic, but it didn't seem to make any sense.
Yeah.
So that was a very cool idea, right? So now in the psychology and neurology of its time, actually quite brilliant. So there's a part of the brain that's responsible for output, for production. There's a part of the brain that's responsible for comprehension. And then you need a cable between the two because you have a comprehension area and a production area, and then those are linked to your mouth and your ear. Interesting. So then a few years later, the neurologist Lichtheim integrated all this information and said, well, you also need to have sort of conceptual information. So they came up with this in the literature called the house model. So there's, the motor images, acoustic images, concepts, and then the whole thing is sort of the kind of boxology of the model looks like a house. Now, what's really important to know is that this particular way of conceptualizing processing was really successful clinically. That is to say, if you have some kind of behavioral deficit as a consequence of a neural injury, you will get diagnosed on the basis of that 19th century model, right? Today as well. So if you regrettably had a stroke right now and you get brought to the, whatever is your local hospital, that will be the model underlying the diagnosis, which should make you real nervous if you're a linguist, because it's not the most modern thing. So what's wrong? So first of all, so that's sort of what's right with it. That's its historical origin, and I think it's sort of deeply moving. It's also, problematic that it's from 1885, more or less, and it's now, 2021. And so what's wrong with it? I mean, other than we sort of give our, pay our respects to its clinical utility, and it's animated the field, neuroscience more broadly, by the way, because it was the first really formal and sort of robust statement about functional localization in the brain, which is now basically the standard story. Well, what's wrong with it is that it's sort of underspecified with respect to the biology, which you can imagine, we know a lot about these brain areas, and they turn out to be comprised of multiple brain areas. There's no Broca's area. There's like a Broca's region that's made up of, between 10 and 20 different parts. Mm-hmm. So you can't just say, this is the function of that. There's lots of stuff going on there. So the biology is different. The connectivity is much more sophisticated. We know more about cells and what they're doing. So that's not that surprising, simply accumulation of evidence. We know way more about how stuff works. But of course, from a linguistic point of view, you have to decide, well, is that the right cut, right? So is the production versus comprehension the right way to cut nature at its seams? And there is something to be said for it in terms of the input and output systems, but it's also, of course, really doesn't capture the richness of the system, right? So there's nothing about the representations or the computations that are part of the language system. So what is it that you actually know when you know a language? How does vocabulary get stored? How does it get put together? What does it mean to have successful comprehension or production? What are the underlying potential models linguistically, psycholinguistically? So of course, none of that was available.
Yeah.
But this model was very resilient and still is. So it's only, so its next development was in the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, it became clear that, you know, very careful analysis of patient data, it couldn't be simply production in the front, comprehension in the back. So a subsequent claim was, well, maybe the cut is actually syntax versus semantics. It's more syntactic type processing or operations are more associated with frontal cortex, and semantic type things are more in the posterior cortex. But that was an interesting sort of next step, the sort of at the level of cognitive psychology intersects with linguistics. But that too, of course, is dramatically underspecified with respect to how we study the domain, right? So now there's, so for the last, let's say 20 years, a bunch of us have been trying to figure out, well, what would it look like? What would an organization actually look like? That's a little bit more closely, that allows you to ask questions about linguistics, but also is plausibly embedded in modern neuroscience. So that's sort of one of the lines of functional neuroanatomic research that many people are doing.
So something you touched upon there was sort of functional localization, and linguists, psycholinguists have been keen to stress modularity of mind. Do you see the notion of sort of faculty of language and things is often criticized because, as you said, we can't find one bit of the brain that corresponds to doing the language stuff. Do you see that as problematic at all for the notion of faculty of language, that if it's distributed across various parts of the brain?
No, I think it has no bearing on it. I mean, I think that's a poverty of the imagination argument. I mean, stuff is complicated, okay? So the notion, now, we have no idea how it could work. It's just too complicated at the moment, right? Because there's too many parts involved. But suppose you were talking about a different part of you know, the mind and brain. Would you make the same argument? So suppose something that's really near and dear to you is something like breathing, right? Or your heartbeat, or the regulation of your temperature. So all the structures that are largely in the brainstem, you will find it not surprising that those are extremely highly organized nuclei that are extremely modular and do very, very particular kind of things that you need to function. So there are plenty of examples in brains, including in mammalian brains, of highly, highly organized tissue that's super modular, right? So it's not like, oh my God, what a shitty idea, you know, how could it possibly be? I mean, similarly about other, you know, you can say that about the liver or something, you know, liver is the liver. It does lots of cool stuff, but it's, you know, well defined. So psychological or mental systems or organs like language are unlikely to be single spot because they draw on lots of different stuff. So, I mean, take one of the most interesting things about the linguistic system, and whatever it is and wherever it is, that it can interface seamlessly with sound, like we're using now, or vision, like when you're reading, or vision when you're signing, or touch when you're reading Braille. So whatever happens in the, kind of, let's call it central representational systems, has to be able to take as input and output data structures stuff from any sensory modality. So that's pretty clever, right? So it means stuff coming from the back of the head for vision, from the temporal lobe for hearing, from up here for touch. So very different pathways are generating structures that then align with what you have to do. And let's, you know, I don't like to call it central system, but whatever, that kind of the linguistic, the system that does, let's say, concatenation, structure building, constituency, long distance relations, everything that's part of, let's say, discrete infinity. And so those things are, since everything is coming from somewhere else, it has to be relatively flexible in terms of what data structures it outputs. At the same time, it has to be coherent because, you know, we can have the same conversation with whether we're reading, signing, brailing, right, and so on. So it places an extremely interesting constraint on how you want to do it. And because those constraints are sort of all over the place, it means that it's unlikely to be just everything converges to one spot from all the different sensory motor systems. And then there's like a little blob that says, oh, here I'm doing this. So it's a bit more likely that the kinds of elementary operations sit in different places in the head. But that doesn't belie, that's sort of irrelevant. The notion of modularity is a functional one, not an anatomic one. So the question is, to what extent are this is the notion that Fodor called cognitive penetrability. And so to what extent do you build a representation that really has to be shallowly processed for a certain kind of thing? And it doesn't care about the phase of the moon or like, your grandmother's birthday. It just does what it does because it works on relatively specific things and generates outputs. And so whether that's localized or distributed, what do I care? Well, I care because I want to figure it out how it works. But it doesn't speak to that issue of functional isolation or penetrability or informational encapsulation, which is another way to talk about it in Fodorian terms.
Yeah.
So it's for me, that issue that people get pretty exercised about is a bit of a red herring. So showing spatial overlap or spatial non-overlap are sort of coarse hints, but they're not even closely good enough for this. I mean, because if Gallistel is right and there's a lot of intracellular computation, then we're screwed anyway. Then we don't know anything. I mean, then we have to start from scratch more or less. And then neurolinguistics ultimately will become a species of molecular biology. So that'll be fun. So you can do deep learning and molecular biology. Those will be your future fields.
Yeah. So to go back to Fodorian terms, one of the 8 or 9 criteria is that sort of dedicated neural architecture. To read that, it sounds like to read that as a localized neural architecture would be a misreading.
Yeah, I don't think it was Fodor meant either. I mean, dedicated here means, is there a kind of circuitry?
Yeah.
I mean, Fodor was a smart guy. He was also a very eccentric man and a funny writer, very funny writer. But he's not that naive, right? And so it's about, is the circuitry that supports particular kind of representational infrastructure and the computations over those representations dedicated in the sense of, let's say this circuit works on, this kind of input, but not this other kind of input. So this Lego block fits, but this other Lego block, which is an L shape, it's sort of like Tetris. That one doesn't work. So that's what's at stake actually, right? So it's a specific. Now, the question is that right? Right, and that's where things in active research are going. So suppose you have an operation that takes 2 items, puts them together, and then labels them, right? So some form of what you might call merge in shorthand.
Yeah.
So is that operation, which could be very generic, specific to the language system, or does the specificity merely arise in virtue of the terminal elements that get inserted into that computation?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have, an A and a B kind of thing, does it matter? So maybe all that matters is that the right thing fits onto this A slot and the right thing fits onto the B slot. But what really determines what it is actually the part of the inventory that comes up. So maybe it's a musical note and a musical note.
Yeah.
In which case it's nothing to do with language. It just happens to take that kind of operation. Namely, you take 2 things, you stick them together, you put a hat on them. Right. So this is where things get a little bit more tricky. You have to make commitments to wherein lies. So I think that there's a huge amount of specialization in what we have stored as the inventory. That strikes me as nothing. That seems very unique and weird.
Yeah.
Whereas other things. So if I had to put my money on it right now for the next 20 years, I'd say we can make good progress on computation because it's generic enough that we might find examples in animal preps and other experiments and other systems, perhaps, let's say motor control or something like that. But the inventory, let's say the vocabulary, the mental lexicon, or whatever you want to call it, that has sort of lexical and encyclopedic knowledge that you point to, that is a hard problem. And a lot of specificity lies in that. That's my prediction. I'm willing to be wrong, but what do I care?
So besides the move from the classical model, rather than looking forward, let's look back. In the last 60 years or so, where, as you mentioned, a lot of, well, linguistic theory as we know it started. What do you think the most important discoveries in the psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic research are?
So it's a very good question. I mean, I wrote this chapter about the contributions of Chomsky to neuroscience or something like that, where I kind of complained a bit in the sense that the contributions have been absolutely foundational in the on the one third just annoying, and one third just ignored. So are there insights in let's say biology of language that have been particularly noteworthy? There have been, but the question is, have they been noteworthy for our understanding of language, or have they been noteworthy for our understanding of some other system, right? So is there something that we've learned about how the language system works by doing, let's say, psycholinguistics or neurolinguistics? Or have we simply used linguistics because it's a very well delineated and formalized domain to learn something about how brains do complex computation? So the latter, I think, is for sure true. And so I think we've learned a lot about how brains are organized. So for example, the thing that Greg Hickok and I carried on about some years ago, what we call the dual stream model of recognition, which has become quite popular in terms of as a sort of hypothesis about processing, about the neural architecture. And the reason we found, I haven't worked on it for many years, but the reason we were moved by that direction of research is because it leans very closely on how other systems are organized in the brain, like the visual system, for instance. And so we're trying to see, like, are there underlying broader principles that are simply recycled? As you take some broad domain and you basically carve up the problem into subproblems, like this subroutine and that subroutine, and you capitalize on whatever structures that are available are really good for that. Mm-hmm. And so that was, that was one reason to do this kind of dual stream reasoning, which is now there's sort of many species of models like that. But Hickok and I spent a lot of time working out the initial fractionation of that, and that's turned out to be pretty useful for neuroscience. I don't think it's been useful for linguistics. I mean, no linguist can be like, wow, yeah, so you have to be able to say stuff and you have to be able to recognize it. Like, whoop-de-doo-da. So it's not super, but on the other hand, it is very useful if you're trying to build functional anatomic insights into how would you implement this kind of stuff. So at the implementation level. Yeah. I think there have been some extremely interesting insights about that are sort of confirmatory for linguists. When I talk about it, linguists are like, I can't believe you spent money on this kind of stuff. But it's for example, the notion of constituency. I mean, that's not an innocent notion. People are like, what's the big deal? You take an X and a Y and you make an XY hat, but actually it is a big deal because it shows you something about representational structure and it shows you that, for instance, language processing is not a string of beads, that it has actually notions of structure dependence and constituency. Now, again, for a linguist, you're like, yeah, obviously that's like lesson one, right? But for a psychologist or a cognitive scientist or a neuroscientist, that's actually important because it means that it allows us to actually probe certain things that you take for granted in the cognitive sciences, but that we need to know how do you actually do it? How do you actually write it down? Where would you do it? So something as simple as constituency, there have been, surprisingly few studies on that. You'd think it's an old concept, but maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 experiments. But I think that's, for example, a very important insight where cognitive sciences tell us what to maybe be looking for in other fields. I think that's cool. I think we've also learned a fair amount about phonetics and phonology. And so one argument, the other, so as I was telling you earlier, right, one argument in the other direction might be that while a bunch of us are really pretty convinced that a notion like distinctive feature is really, a critical notion for any kind of, phonetics and phonology in particular, there are other levels of representation that are very contentious, like the notion of a syllable. And there, I think experimental work can say, look, those are actually important insights. If it's true that that's sort of the chunk size that's foundational for processing. Well, that's important to know because your theory is accountable for that, right? So I'm going to push hard, or have pushed hard on that, to be very sensitive to syllabicity as a core notion for what you have to achieve, even though it's, of course, a bigger unit, right? So it's, I mean, you need segmental phonology. It's not a substitute, but the question is, how are these things organized to get the range of phenomena that you actually get in recognition and production and storage? Like, what's the notion of a minimal pair even like? What's it defined over, and so on. So it's not innocent.
Yeah. So what do you've mentioned some already, particularly about the inputs, representational inputs, perhaps language specific, perhaps not, function state. What do you think the most promising areas of research going forward are, and what work do you find particularly exciting and interesting at the moment?
I think that sticking with the brain stuff, right, is that I'm, as is clear from my own scientific biography, I'm really swayed by electrophysiological approaches. And that has to do with the fact that, languages in general, perception, production, those are fast processes.
Yeah.
And to really get as it were, wrap your head around these things, you want techniques that have a temporal resolution appropriate to the sort of underlying boxology that you're trying to unravel and unveil and describe and so on. So I am, in general, I'm most fascinated by advances in techniques of, electroencephalography, magnetoencephalography, electrocorticography, and some other imaging. So I think there's really important work being done using functional neuroimaging that's about the sort of localization-based reasoning, and it's fascinating, and a lot of it is important. For me, it's less germane to addressing the questions that are closer to the cognitive science concerns, which is, what's the representational, what are the primitives, and what are the primitive operations? And to get to that, you need models that are sort of dynamic in time. So neural dynamics seems to me very important. And in general, I'm interested in that. So one of the things that I think is going to be, in that area, just to sort of close that parenthesis, right? There's a lot of developments in that area, technical developments that are exciting, that allows you to go further and further into details. Partly that has to do with cool data analysis techniques, like decoding techniques that are very fancy, sort of machine learning based techniques. So if you have good questions, you can get more and more into specific stuff. For example, much of what we do in psycholinguistics, neurolinguistics, is extremely controlled experimentation, and we need that, right? So let's say you present a bunch of minimal pairs or something, right? So you get really granular. But of course, in the end, one of the things, what's like our explanandum, is to try to figure out what we're doing right now. We're just having a conversation. And how does that actually work? So increasingly, there are techniques available to begin to study linguistic phenomena in a more naturalistic context. And that's pretty cool. And because that doesn't, and not in a sense of you're giving up on the notion of control, but sort of paired with experimentation. But it's very interesting how much sort of rich data about language processing per se you can get out of just now data that are recorded while someone, say, listening to stories or something like that. And that's nice because in the end, that's what we're interested in, right? So, I mean, you're not interested in, oh, I can figure out these three minimal pairs. I mean, you have to figure out how it works while you're doing it. That's the fun in real time. And so I think that, so some of the techniques that people have developed really in machine learning and AI that, are extremely useful for data analysis. It does not follow that using those techniques is a model for minds and brains, right? So I think you want to be careful about that. So you would be a fool not to use the most cutting edge techniques to wrangle with your weird data. But that's for data analysis. That's trying to understand, how do you actually parse the problem? I think that's, so look, one thing that's going to happen, for instance, is electrophysiological techniques will get finer and finer, and we're going to start to do things at the other end of the spectrum, like single cell recordings in human brains, obviously in clinical contexts. So we're now going to have the sort of, at the coarsest grain, something like fMRI, which sees the whole brain very high spatial resolution, better than a millimeter if you want, at very low temporal resolution. And at the highest level, you see something very, and you want that because, you know, brains are, they're sort of network principles. It matters how things are wired up over the different systems.
Mm.
And at the finest grain, you can start to look at single cells. So now you have a very narrow view. Your lens is just a single cell of, you know, 86 billion. And you can try to figure out what's going on there. And the fun and the excitement will be to figure out how much information is stored or carried from cell to circuit to system, and hopefully motivated, you know, kind of theoretically well motivated and computationally very explicit, so you can kind of quantify and study these things. But I think that's going to be pretty cool, modulo that, of course, these kinds of data always come from patients that are very ill.
Yeah.
Now, it's wonderful that a lot of patients are willing to participate in research because they have to be there anyway, and it can be very meaningful to people to participate in this kind of research. But we want, of course, increasing techniques to do it other ways. And so another way to do stuff that's, I think, promising, but requires great theoretical finesse and care, is to look in a more creative way at animal models. Mm-hmm. Right? So I'm not going to look at an animal model to study, say, principle C. I mean, that doesn't seem like the right way to break the problem down. On the other hand, if there is a problem, you know, that I can characterize at a computational level in a pretty generic way from an engineering sense, right? So really parse the problem apart and say, look, this is the kind of thing that has to happen. Then what's wrong with studying that in an animal model in which you would learn about that? So this is now going to the implementational level of analysis, right? Mm-hmm. Again, it doesn't mean that you think, you know, bird songs is like syntax or monkeys are doing this, that, or the other thing. It's you're trying to figure, this is an implementation level question. You're saying, I believe you need this kind of circuit to point to all the different things that, you know, a recognized word connects with, so whatever it is. You know? So can you decompose the problems into kind of generic subroutines that you could then look at in other creatures, because, you know, evolution is conservative and the stuff is retained. So we do stuff differently. Our brain's kind of differently organized, so different stuff happens. But if we at the level of the brain structure and function, we can make some progress without making weird theoretical claims. Just some, as it were, nuts and bolts, right? How's the stuff wired together? There's nothing wrong with doing animal models as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Seems totally plausible.
All right. Thanks so much for your time. It's been great to have you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and fun to talk to you.
Thank you.